This is episode 76 of Changing the Face of Yoga, and I am talking today about osteoporosis and yoga. Osteoporosis is very difficult to even know that you have until you break a bone, and yoga is helpful to strengthen those bones. So let's listen. I also have an opportunity for you. Hersha Yoga is offering an online course to teach you or expand your knowledge in the area of accessible yoga for pregnant women. And it is available now, and you can sign up at http://bit.ly/Hersha. And that's HERSHA, all caps. And if you put in this code when you are paying for the course, you will receive 15% off. So the code is CFOYHERSHA. Again, all caps. So that may be an opportunity for those of you that want to learn or to expand your knowledge about providing accessible yoga for pregnant women. Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. Hi, this is Stephanie Cunningham, and this is episode 77. And I'm going to be all by myself on this episode. I'm going to talk about something that I've been studying for some time, which is yoga and osteoporosis. So what osteoporosis is that the bones become less dense and the risk factor for fractures becomes larger. And there are two times in your life when this is more likely to happen, that the bone density will decrease. One is around the 50s, around menopause, and as far as I know, they haven't actually figured out why this has happened yet, but the cells that build bone become less active than the cells that destroy bone. And both of those are very natural processes. As a bone becomes older, then it's destroyed and new bone is laid down. But for some reason, when the sex hormones start to decrease at that point in time, the destructive cells become much more active than the building cells. The second time is probably 20 to 30 years later, when through natural aging, usually the musculoskeletal system becomes more fragile. The bones begin to become less active, less dense, less strong. And as a result, because one of the triggers for bone growth, for putting down more bone, for becoming more dense, is the muscles pulling on those bones, saying, hey, we need more structure here because we're working hard. So as people become less active and the muscles in the bones become more fragile, then the density of the bones decreases also. You can have osteoporosis because illness or medications. I had a student who had a thyroid disorder, and she had osteoporosis. And once that thyroid disorder was fixed and cured and all of that, her osteoporosis became less of a problem and her bone density increased. Also, people who've taken steroids for long periods of time, that apparently also affects bone density. So those are the other two things that might cause it. But for the most part, it is going to be because of aging. And unfortunately, women are much more likely to get it than men. We actually have more bone loss than men do, especially in our axial skeleton. And we usually don't have the bone density that most men have because we don't have the musculature that they have. So both of those issues. And so we have older women and some older men who have osteoporosis. So how do we know that? Well, there is a test. It's called the DEXA test, and it's an X-ray test. And what it's looking for is bone density. However, the strength of the bone is also determined by the microarchitecture of the bone. And the bone on the inside of the bone is a whole series of little arches. And arches are the strongest structure in nature, or at least I've been told that, but I think that's probably true. And so if those arches are breaking down, either through loss of minerals or for that the bone destroyers are working harder than the bone builders, that can also cause the bone to be more fragile and you become much more at risk for fractures. So the DEXA test looks at bone mineral density, and that's about only maybe half of the story. So it is an indicator. I don't know how good an indicator it is, though, but I just will tell you that what it does is it X-rays 3 areas. It X-rays the hip, it X-rays the vertebrae, it X-rays the wrist. And those are the 3 areas where most people will have a fracture if they're going to from osteoporosis. It will give you a score for each of those sites. And the score, there's 3 levels of scores. There's the normal score, which means that yes, you have lost some bone density, but everybody loses bone density. So you're in the normal range. You started at a pretty good place and you have lost some, but you really haven't increased your risk of fracture. The second level is osteopenia. And that is a level where you have lost enough bone density to have increased your risk for fracture. Then the third level is osteoporosis. Now, this means that you have lost so much bone density that you are at high risk of fracture. So there's a continuum there from losing a little bit of bone to losing more to losing enough to be a concern. Okay, so when a bone fractures, first of all, there's a great deal of pain, and it can be continuing pain because there's really no symptoms of osteoporosis that one can be aware of until a bone fractures. Now, you may be aware that you have osteoporosis because you've had this test, but in general, you are kind of unaware of it. You're probably the right age, and you may wonder if you have it, but there's really no way you can tell until you start breaking a bone. And if you break a bone in the vertebral column, that can lead to a secondary problem, which is kyphosis, or I'm sure you've heard it called dowager's hump, where basically the structure of the spinal column has been damaged and it can't hold up the trunk like it used to. So you often see mainly women who are kind of bent in the thoracic area, although I was out at a cafe once and I saw an older woman walk by and she literally, her trunk was parallel to the ground. Her vertebral column was so fractured that it couldn't hold her up at all. So it can be quite serious. And the other thing it can do is if you'll think about that, if you'll get kind of hunch your back and pull your head down, try to take a deep breath. It's really hard because you don't have any room, okay? Plus the fact that kyphosis is a very large risk factor for having another vertebral fracture because you aren't in the best position and you're kind of scrunching your vertebrae together. So you really want to look at how you can avoid having either vertebral fractures or any fracture, and then as a result getting kyphosis. So what we need to do is exercise is recommended for people with osteoporosis. And weight-bearing exercise particularly is recommended. And what that's doing is you're moving those muscles. And so the muscles are pulling on the bones, and the bones are saying, oh, I'm supposed to get more dense. So you're just using a natural occurrence within the body to kind of signal to it that you need some more density in your bones. There's two different parts that we'll talk about. One's the axial skeleton, and the axial skeleton is the skull, the ribs, and the vertebrae. Okay, so that's your core area with all those bones that are protecting your organs and giving you structure and that kind of thing. So those particular areas are quite, especially in women, because we tend to lose more bone in our axial skeleton than men do. Often fractures from osteoporosis do occur in the vertebrae. So we want to keep the vertebrae as dense as we can, and we can do that through exercise. And so we want a couple of things that are really helping that particular part of the skeleton. And one is to make sure that you have really good core muscles that are strong and are, one, kind of holding the body up along with the vertebrae. And secondly, are pulling on the vertebrae, the ribs, to strengthen those areas. And what can we do with that? Well, I'm not sure I'm going to say this correctly, but Dr. Mersheed Sinaki, who is a researcher at the Mayo Clinic in the U.S., has done quite a lot of research on osteoporosis. And I will have all of those sites in the show notes. I'm not going to go through them here. They're kind of boring to say anyway. Interesting to read, but boring to say. And what she's saying is that we need a great deal more than just looking at the weight-bearing exercises, that we should be looking holistically when we're talking about exercising for people who have osteoporosis. And one of the things that she said, you should really work on flexibility and core strength and axial strength, which is for, the back, the spine. And I'm trying to find this. There we go. Cardiovascular fitness and gait steadiness. Because one of the things that kyphosis does, as you can imagine, is it really affects your balance. You're kind of out of where your space is different than where you were before. So when you're moving, it's often difficult for you to have a good balance, and balance decreases with age anyway. So that is a problem. So she has a very holistic view of how one should exercise if one is suffering from osteoporosis or osteopenia. And obviously yoga is really good for many of these things. So the first thing is, what do we do for the axial skeleton, which is the vertebrae, which is where most fractures for women occur who have osteoporosis or osteopenia. You can have fractures with osteopenia, but your risk is not quite as high. So the things that she recommends is a gentle locust. So just basically laying on your stomach on the floor and bringing up the head, keeping the head in line with the spine. Don't throw it back, or we have another problem. And just bringing that up. So you're contracting those upper back muscles, and then you're relaxing down. If you and the student feel that they're strong enough, they can also clasp their hands behind their back and then bring up the chest and pull a little bit with the hands, making the locust pose a little stronger. So that's a good one. You can lay on the back and just lift the head up. So you'll see that stretches and contracts a bit. You can stand and you can raise the arm up while the opposite leg is slightly bent at the knee. And you can hold on to a chair or the wall if there's a balance problem there. And you're just, slowly bringing up that one arm, and then with the breath, and then bringing it down, and then bringing up the other arm. If the musculoskeletal system is strong enough, you can add weights to that after a while. Again, still gently with the breath, but bringing up the arm, really working those back muscles and core muscles to help you do that around there. And if you have students who are sitting, what you can do is bring the arms up to shoulder height, bend the elbows, and then press the elbows back. And then relax, then press back. So doing it with the breath and doing it, be selective about how many times you ask them to do it. They can also do something similar where if they can't bring their arms up, they can just have their arms at the side with the elbows bent. And again, just pushing the elbows back and then releasing with the breath. Okay. So you can strengthen the back in all of those three positions for all of those people who can either get down on the floor or cannot get down on the floor, like to stand or need to sit. So all of those things are helpful and they're pretty gentle. What you should be really aware of, though, is that to be starting very gently and working your way up, because it's a little unclear probably as to how much their bones are fragile at this point. Like I said, the test is helpful, but not definitive. And so you can hurt people with yoga poses. I think if you're pretty sensible, you'll have less problem with that. But I will talk about that a little later. But just know that, yes, yoga can help, but it also might be harmful at the same time. Now, what are yoga poses for the appendicular skeleton? And the appendicular skeleton is the limbs and the pelvic and shoulder girdles. Okay, so they're the ones that where you might have fractures. You often have fractures at the neck of the head of the femur. And of course, when that breaks, you're going to fall because you have no stability on that one side. And there are often the results of hips fracture or often death, because I'm not entirely sure why, but there is a high correlation between a hip fracture and dying. So it's quite a serious fracture. And again, the kinds of things that you can do is almost all standing poses are good because you're using your legs. Often in yoga, we'll have where our movements actually have the muscles pulling on the bones in different directions. And that supposedly is a very efficient way to build bone. So you can do a myriad of standing poses. You can, although Warrior I is not recommended, we'll talk a little bit about contraindicated poses in a minute. Downward dog is really good. And for the shoulder girdle, the arms, you can do that against the wall. You can do it with a chair. So it can be modified to help people. And of course, balance poses are great because when you're standing on one leg, you are having that leg take all of the weight of your body. Plus, it's a little bit off center. So your leg has to really work those muscles and to keep your balance and to also hold the whole body. So that's a really good part. It's building those really strong muscles in the legs, like the quads, the hamstrings, the glutes. And the other issue is that you're really working on balance. Now, balance can be improved, but it's very much like a muscle. It has to be worked and it has to be challenged to continue to see improvements in balance. But one of the reasons, if you haven't had a hip fracture and you fall, that's often when the wrists or the arms will break, will have the fracture there, and you might possibly, depending on how you fall, break the hip or break the spine, vertebrae also. So you really want to help them with their balance because falling is a very high indicator of fractures, and we're trying to keep them away from all kinds of fractures. Now, what shouldn't you do? Well, I will give you the site for Dr. Sinaki's study on 3 cases of people who were doing yoga and suffered more fractures, specifically some in the vertebrae. And one because she was doing headstands. Now, I have been teaching seniors for many years, and I don't recommend inversions of almost any kind, especially headstands. And that's the reason why, is that their skeleton, their vertebrae may not be the strongest part of them, and putting them on their head and telling them to kick up is probably not a really great idea. So the kinds of things that you don't want to do are things that really do put a lot of pressure on the vertebrae. So that would be plow. Again, I don't think a really common pose in an older person's class, but who knows. Handstands, I'd be really leery of because of balance issues. If they fall, they could fracture something. I think that seated twist, bridge and forward bends are extreme spinal flexion. And if the vertebrae are not strong, that could cause them to fracture or microfracture. So I don't recommend any kind of forward bends. The ones I would do in my class was I would bend the knees, and they would try to, as straight as possible, put their chest on their knees. So they didn't go all the way down, and yet they were getting a bit of a stretch in the back. I think that was a safer way to do it. Seated twists are quite forceful, they really twist the lower lumbar spine. That's often an area that has some bone density loss. So I would not ever do seated twist. And Dr. Sinaki agrees with me on that one. So don't Warrior I, because so many people really curve in that lumbar spine, is also not recommended with people for osteoporosis, or anything really that does really curve the spine, okay? You want to stretch it. You want to use your muscles to stretch it out, pulling on that, but being very careful about, one, putting too much stress on it, like if you are in a headstand or plow, and secondly, really putting a lot of pressure because of twist or really contracting that lower spinal area. It can cause fractures. That's one of the sites I will give you about the woman who her daughter gave her a yoga sequence, and she was doing headstands, and she had osteoporosis in her spine. So it caused several fractures, and she was in a lot of pain. And so you have to be really careful and really kind of sensible. I've taught a lot of seniors, and I know sometimes they do not want to not do things or not do the most vigorous modification of the pose because of emotional issues about they're getting old and they really don't want to think about that or something. I'm not sure what it is, but it's really, really important when you're working with people with osteoporosis to start them very, very gentle. Maybe everyone is sitting, maybe everyone is just doing things in the chair or with a hand on the chair standing, and you gradually work up the musculature so that you are not causing fractures by asking them to do too much too soon. You can get, I've given you those poses. You can use modifications to do it against the wall, do it with a chair. However, it's best. But I would certainly err on the side of modifications that are less strenuous. And then as you build muscle and hopefully building the bone, then you can move on to other kinds of more vigorous modifications of these types of poses. But remember that they have, other than a fracture, other than pain, they don't know that they have osteoporosis. They might suspect it because of their test, but there are no symptoms. And so you don't know. And so I think it's really best to be cautious, shall we say. Now, there's a couple of other things that yoga can do for someone who has osteoporosis. If the person has had the vertebral fractures and has kyphosis of some kind, and we already talked about how that is a difficult position to be in to really take some good breathing. You could give them some tools about breathing if they could get more space in their chest, perhaps lifting up their arms a little if they can do that. Laying down might give them more room in the chest just to breathe deeply and slowly. Because as yoga teachers, that if you don't breathe, then you're seriously impacting lots of things. But one of the things you're impacting is energy. And people really do need energy to exercise, and they need to exercise to help with their bone density. So we want to give them all the tools they can to help themselves. Now, the other thing is there's one study, it's fairly new. I didn't see any other studies that were looking at this, so we'll just take it as a possibility at this point until it's been confirmed by other studies. But one study did find that there was a negative correlation between osteoporosis and disturbed sleep. So in other words, if you have disturbed sleep, you are more likely to have osteoporosis, which may be a positive correlation now that I think about it. But anyway, the point is, if you are having a disturbed sleep, this study thought that you had a higher risk of having osteoporosis. Okay. I do know, having worked with seniors for a long time, that many of them have insomnia, which would be considered disturbed sleep. So that is one thing that you may want to think about. If it helps with either not getting osteoporosis or not getting it as badly, then what's the harm? But I often do a yoga nidra in the shavasana part of my classes because I've had students who've come to me and said afterwards that yoga nidra is the only time during the whole week that I really can totally relax and get some rest. Now, they weren't asleep. They were in that funny place you get to with shavasana, but they felt really relaxed and they really, really enjoyed it. So I would suggest that whatever you do for shavasana, it's up to you, is that you kind of concentrate on giving them some tools to relax and letting them kind of go into that state that we get to in shavasana. And that might lead then again to sleep. So I think yoga has a great deal to offer to people who have osteoporosis between our poses and our mini modifications, our breathing, our emphasis on breathing, and our relaxation techniques. But do be aware that yoga can be dangerous. And if the student is pushing themselves or they're doing poses that are not a good idea for this group, they can suffer similar fractures. So this is Stephanie Cunningham. If you would like to comment on this particular podcast, you can go to www.yogalightness.com.au/podcast. And there will be a form there where you can send in your comments. And I'd be most interested in hearing them. I don't claim to know everything about osteoporosis, but I have been doing a lot of study on it. And I think it is important that we realize that as much as yoga is beneficial, it also has another side. So, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.